Thank you all for being here for the second session of the day for IJNR's Great Lakes Energy Futures Workshop. We are now turning our attention. We talked a little bit about the bigger level overview of the Inflation Reduction Act and infrastructure bill and other things that are kind of driving some of the clean energy transition. But we wanted to get our focus now more narrowly on the Great Lakes region. And we have some excellent folks here to help us do that and talk us through what's going on in their respective states, and how those activities are resulting in on the ground actual energy and efficiency efforts. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you Douglas Jester and Justin Fay and Stacy Paradis. And Douglas is the managing partner at Five Lakes Energy, which focuses on energy policies, economic analysis, modeling, and expert witness testimony. Previously, he was a senior energy policy advisor in Michigan, using his background in science, engineering, and economics for state energy policy development. Douglas has, saying he has a diverse academic and professional background is maybe an understatement. He has degrees in fields such as mathematics, biology, and economics from New Mexico State University and Michigan State University. He began his career at Los Alamos National Laboratory, followed by significant roles in the Michigan Departments of Natural Resources and all sorts of contributions to energy and technology sectors, including developing Michigan's automated system for issuing hunting and fishing licenses. He has also got a fisheries biology background. Anyway, he's been recognized for his innovation by the Smithsonian Museum, has held leadership positions in technology firms, and also served as the East Lansing mayor. So there's all kinds of things you could ask Douglas, but we're asking him to stick to energy for for this particular session. Then we have Justin. Justin leads public affairs at Fresh Energy. Hey, folks, Francis, can you mute people and just go through and see where that's coming from? Justin leads public affairs at Fresh Energy, they're focused on shaping and advancing the organization's strategy to achieve an equitable carbon neutral economy in Minnesota through engagement with decision makers and partnerships. He brings his fact-based professional approach to addressing complex public issues, supported by his experience with the Sierra Club North Star chapter and roles in various environmental campaigns and organizations. Justin holds a Master of Public Policy and an undergraduate degree from the University of Minnesota. And then we have Stacy Paradis. She is a commissioner with the Illinois Commerce Commission. She was appointed to that role by Governor Pritzker on April of 2023 and brings over 25 years of experience in energy policy and nonprofit management. She was the former executive director of the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, and we will hear from that group later in this workshop, and has led strategic initiatives and manages significant amount of things across multiple states, all focusing on energy efficiency. Her work included overseeing policy initiatives and stakeholder processes to create state energy plans in Kentucky, underpinned by a U.S. Department of Energy grant. And we are just thrilled to have everyone here and available to talk to us. And I'm not sure how we left the lineup, but who decided to go first? And
I don't think any of us did.
okay, so should have followed up on that question on the email. I don't know that it necessarily matters because we brought you all here because you each represent a different Great Lakes state. So we don't want to pick favorites. I guess alphabetically, Stacy, you are with the IL, so we could queue you up first if you're ready to go.
That's fine.
All right.
Let me give me 1 second. So hopefully you guys can see. Let me put it in presentation mode.
Now we're seeing your notes. Oh, now we're seeing the proper slide.
Awesome.
Great, thanks.
So, yes, so I am Stacey Paradis. I'm excited to be here with you guys today. I have to put a caveat up here. Obviously, I can't talk about anything that we have an open docket on right now. And in Illinois, we kind of have an open docket on almost everything right now. So we're going to lean back into CEJA and some of the components of CEJA and use an example of that of energy efficiency and how energy efficiency has kind of evolved through policy over time. And then at the end, I'll talk about some takeaways regarding implementation. So just to give everyone a sense, in Illinois, these are, when we talk about energy efficiency policies, they start as something called energy efficiency resource standards or energy efficiency portfolio standards. Basically, they are energy savings goals, and they're usually set up with a savings target. And they're often done for electricity, but they're also done for natural gas. So in Illinois, actually, it goes back many, many, many years. So you'll see in here in 2007, there was the Illinois Power Agency Act was what first established our electric energy efficiency standards. And then a few years later, we had gas standards that were also added. Then in 2016, after multiple years, the Future Energy Jobs Act really made substantial changes to the electricity savings requirements. It didn't really touch on natural gas. And then most recently in 2021, Illinois passed the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act that also had some changes to the energy efficiency policies. So as you can see here, it just kind of goes through what the savings targets are that were established. And then just to give you an idea of where it was all coming from, in 2016, before FEJA went into place, this is what the efficiency programs looked like. It was very focused on these buckets: single family homes, commercial buildings, and then industrial, which were done. At the time, prior to FEJA passing, 25% of any of the funds that were brought in through from ratepayers were given to the state of Illinois, to the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. It was their responsibility to run low income and public sector programs. They were also required to then achieve 20% of the savings. As once FEJA passed, all of that responsibility passed on to the utilities. And one thing to note, the industrial programs, you'll see an evolution in how industrial customers have been involved. In the beginning, industrial customers were fully participating in the programs. When FEJA passed in 2016, there were some changes. Again, it really only focused on the electric energy efficiency standard. It did not touch on the natural gas requirements. As I said, it moved programs away from the state of Illinois running them back to the utilities. So the utilities took on those additional responsibilities, meaning they got additional funds coming in. They also had to meet additional savings targets. And then they changed the structure of how the electric utilities had to generate their savings to follow what the requirements of the statute. They have annual savings goals that then evolved into cumulative savings goals based on 4-year portfolio plans that they put together. So you can see those numbers there before you. For those of you that don't know, ComEd is in the northern part of the state and is the largest industrial utility. Ameren is downstate. They are both an electric and a natural gas utility, but that 16% is just related to their electricity efficiency programs. There were also some other changes. Well, let me go back here one second. One of the other things that came up on FEJA, sorry, we have CEJA and FEJA. It sometimes gets a little confusing. Is we did start hearing a lot of conversations within the stakeholder groups of specifically targeting equity incentives, looking at specific targets for low-income communities. So you'll see that throughout this presentation as well. Then when CEJA passed in 2021, it was really focused on statewide power sector decarbonization. And there was obviously a huge focus on equitable workforce development, focusing on environmental justice communities, low-income communities, and then BIPOC communities to making sure that they would be part of the clean energy economy. I should note both FEJA and CEJA took 2 years of negotiation before passage. So there was an extensive stakeholder process that was involved and a lot of work in the legislature for both of those that went into those before they finally were finalized and passed. When you talk about CEJA, there were some additional changes on energy efficiency, not nearly as much as under the 2016 bill, but in 2021, we do allow for electrification, but it's a small amount. It's capped for the electric utilities. Large customers who had been exempted, so were not participating under FEJA, which passed in 2016, they were allowed to now participate again in the programs, and all public sector programs and governments have to participate in the programs. So that was just an additional sector that is now back in the efficiency programs. And I should note, there's a reason why that's important. So industrial programs, large user programs on energy efficiency tend to have a benefit of $2, $3, sometimes $4 to $5 for every dollar that's invested. So the more participation that you have in large users, the more then you're able to balance out related to cost effectiveness, an additional increase in low income programs, which also happened both in 2021 under CEJA. And then you'll see we also built in CEJA things about building energy codes for new buildings. And I'll go through this rather quickly because I don't know how deep you guys want to get into all the programs, but this will just give you all these links will be provided that shows you a budget across the sectors, the focus on whole homes, electrification, really a strong investment. The gas and the gas programs are still on the same portfolio cycle. So our stakeholder advisory groups, which are put together by statute to require all the energy efficiency stakeholders to have the opportunity to participate, gas and electric do those together. And the intention of that is for them to find common ground. So you're not having necessarily difficult proceedings here at the ICC. The hope is that they can all come to an agreement before the plans are filed with the ICC, hopefully making sure that stakeholders are more engaged, making sure that we're also saving time and money. And then this, as I noted, there was a very big focus on low income, and you've seen that in other states in the Midwest where we're trying to put more and more requirements along low income. You can see where there was now minimum spending levels that were assigned to the electric utilities, and then how that broke out, how much of it goes to the whole building, how much goes to health and safety issues. So health and safety issues are very important. So if you go in and audit someone's home, you're going to go through, the energy efficiency contractor is going to go through and say, okay, we could do this. This is the challenge with your HVAC system. But unfortunately you have a hole in your roof or you have mold. And until the homeowner or the building owner is able to pay to address those health and safety issues, utility dollars cannot be used to do the efficiency investments. And so a set aside amount of fundings we're giving to the utilities that they could address the health and safety issues prior to those people getting energy efficiency investments. The intent is to make sure that there is a protection of the ratepayer dollars, to making sure that they're being used for what they're intended for. But obviously we found that with health and safety, and this is an issue nationally, where low income households in particular don't have the money to invest to do those health and safety investments. So not only are they left with a home that has these challenges, they're also not able to benefit from the energy efficiency programs. And so this is an attempt to try to address that issue. As I noted, electrification programs, electric utilities are allowed to do limited savings as they convert people from natural gas. And then again, there's a focus on low income households. The other thing that was done, as I noted, we have a stakeholder advisory group in Illinois on energy efficiency, working with the natural gas and electric utilities. We now also have that same thing, a specific one for low income communities. This just gives you details on where we are in electrification and how much each electric utility is able to claim, just detailing what I talked about earlier. The next thing that was a big addition is codes adoption. So obviously there's a big focus in energy efficiency on new buildings to make sure that those are as energy efficient as possible. So this just goes through that. Illinois has a mandated statewide code that is applicable to everyone in the state with the exception of the city of Chicago. City of Chicago can go above the state code. They can't go below it. But this really speaks to the fact of what other now municipalities are able to do if they want to go, as we develop a stretch code, which means it's higher just than the national code for both residential and commercial buildings. And then this, again, as I mentioned before, CEJA brought industrial customers back into the program, and it's very beneficial based on the increase in cost effectiveness that's in place, but obviously also because these large users are having a substantial amount of emissions that they're doing and using a lot of electricity and other power. So we need to bring them on board so that we can also work with them, since Illinois is one of the top 10 industrial states in the country. This is just, I stole this from my previous employer, from the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. This just gives you a sense. This is a heat map that really tracks the energy efficiency electric savings that have happened over time. You'll see where the spike started happen in 2007, 2008, 2009. That's when a number of Midwestern states put policies in place. You can see a corresponding one on the amount of natural gas savings that has been in place. And then the other piece of that is, how do those savings come about? Well, it comes about based on the investment that is out there. And give me 1 second. I pulled up the wrong deck. I do have a takeaway slide for you guys that I did not pull up, so I apologize. Give me 1 second. If you want, I apologize. Give me one more second. Okay, can you see that?
Yep.
So I thought it would be helpful just to talk through key takeaways based on, as someone that's been on the advocacy side and now as a regulator side, on kind of what we see in the media. One of the things that I talk about a lot that is a challenge is that passing of a bill and a law getting signed into law is really only the first step. Really, the devil is in the details, and that's all about implementation. That is where the work happens, and that's how we know if we really are achieving the goals that have been set forth in the legislation. So I know the stories are always about what passages, and I hope there's an opportunity for the media to really follow up on what happens 1 year later, what happens 6 months later. Are these policies achieving what they said they were? So I think that's a big opportunity. When we talk about energy efficiency specifically, energy efficiency is really going to be, in my mind, the bridge, especially for the next 15 years. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is it provides immediate energy savings and immediate emission reductions. So we can talk about bringing in renewable energy. We can talk about the process that really takes a while to bring those new sources online through the regional transmission organizations. Energy efficiency is something that can save energy immediately. But there's also then the benefits that come from it. So it's not just energy savings and emission reductions. There's also the fact that it really creates and sustains local jobs. I know my friend Douglas Jesser is always talking about this. The great thing about energy efficiency, it's about 70% of all clean energy jobs are energy efficiency jobs. And those are local jobs that are in that community day in and day out. Obviously, when you do those investments, you see increased health benefits, both indoor and outdoor. And then the other important thing on the low income side is reducing the energy burden. There's also the ability, which you've seen in now pieces of legislation, including my fellow speakers from Minnesota and Michigan. You can really set those up to have a specific focus on low income, fixed income, and environmental justice communities as well. A shout out to now my fellow regulators. I think regulators are kind of we're not an unknown entity, but we're one that people aren't probably as aware of, but they are key players in really deciding what the energy future is going to be. Again, because as all these bills are implemented, a lot of them are coming through the PSCs in various states. In Illinois, as I mentioned, CEJA was drafted over 2 years with diverse stakeholder input, really focused on where our power sector is going. And it was very focused on electricity. That is similar, and you'll hear this from the other speakers in Minnesota and Michigan. They've had similar stories over the last few years. And the last thing, if I could ask for anything, implementation and the stories behind it are where you could really tell an individual story. It's an opportunity to highlight a new business that was created in a local community, or people that were able to hire new employees, or for an industrial company, maybe they were able to create a second or third shift based on the energy savings. You can really talk about how the investments in Illinois, energy efficiency investments are almost $600 million a year. So there is a substantial amount of stories out there of how maybe a family was helped financially, maybe they had health improvements, maybe someone was able to get a job from it and how that benefited their family. And the last thing is the other focus that we have in Illinois is really how is this working with diverse suppliers? So speaking to benefiting small businesses, veteran-owned businesses, and diverse-owned businesses. So I would just put those out there. Those are a couple of stories, ideas if you're interested in them. And with that, I will stop sharing. And
All
then
right.
I don't know if you want to do questions now or how you
Uh,
want to do that.
We're gonna hold questions
Wait.
till you've all had your chance, or else we'll never get into the questions. So I'm gonna cue Doug up now, and thanks, Stacy. That was great. And Doug, whenever you're ready, go for
Sure.
it.
Thank you very much. Hi, Stacy. Good to see you again. So I want to reintroduce myself and offer up a few things that can be the basis for questions later, and then talk about some particular things in the Michigan story. So I'm managing partner of Five Lakes Energy. We're a consultancy throughout our history, which is now almost 14 years. Everyone has worked from home. So we're based in Michigan and have a bit of a Michigan focus, but I have staff in Minnesota and California as well as in Michigan. Michigan has certainly been a focus of our work, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but we also have done a fair amount across the country and regionally. So nationally, I have been an expert witness on utility electric vehicle charging infrastructure programs in a lot of states. I've sort of lost count at this point. And we've also done a fair amount of work on street lighting across the country, which is, just a niche that we occupy. Regionally, a lot of engagement in transmission planning, wholesale market design and rules, siting of new renewable projects, and things of that kind. And more recently, work on industrial decarbonization in particular types of industries. So those are things I'm not going to talk much more about, but if you have questions, I'm happy to address those. Michigan, like Illinois, Midwestern state, diverse economy, fairly large population, and therefore fairly large emissions of greenhouse gases. We began process of introducing renewable energy and energy efficiency as utility obligations about the same time that Illinois did. The initial legislation was principally in 2008, and that set standards for energy efficiency similar to what you heard from Stacy for both electric and gas utilities, and a renewable energy standard of 10% by 2015. So that's a standard that says at least 10% of the electricity that Michigan utilities sell to their customers has to be sourced from renewable sources. As we were getting into the 2010s and seeing that policy playing out, many of us wanted to go further. Utilities and the legislature were not particularly interested. And so we began a ballot initiative effort, which was voted on in 2012. It lost. There were 6 questions on the ballot that year. And, I was knowledgeable about all of them. And yet watching television through one commercial break would be completely confused because there'd be an ad for and against each of them back to back. And we wound up with a vote no on everything, campaign and attitude. And so what had started out being a winning initiative failed along with everything else. In the aftermath of that, Governor Snyder was elected. He was supportive of energy efficiency, tolerant of renewable energy, but he did invest political capital in trying to advance energy efficiency. We were able to get another legislative package adopted in 2016, which, as introduced by Republican members of the legislature, would have eliminated those standards. In the end, it mildly sweetened the utility incentives for energy efficiency programs and renamed them as energy waste reduction to put a Snyder brand on it, and increased the renewable energy standard to 15% by 2021. That also set out a number of regulatory proceedings that needed to happen. So there was a fair amount of work happening within the state, advancing clean energy through the Michigan Public Service Commission, beginning in 2017, and frankly continuing to today. But those policies had effectively been, exhausted. When Governor Whitmer was elected, first she campaigned on addressing climate change, and then after being elected, issued an executive order and an executive directive. The executive directive affects things internal to state government. An executive order a little more broadly, but obviously has to be constrained by her lawful powers. And those essentially directed state government to work toward putting Michigan on and keeping us on the Paris path for greenhouse gas reduction. So broadly, the objectives were 26% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 levels by 2025, 52% by 2030, and being at net zero by 2050. And initiated a process called to develop a climate action plan, which was called the Michigan or My Healthy Climate Plan. Everything in Michigan is named MI for my, and then whatever the topic is, which was developed through a stakeholder process and a council on climate solutions, but actually written by the State Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, which we refer to as EAGLE. I served as co-chair of the council's work group on energy production, transmission, distribution, and storage, i.e. all things utility, along with one of the commissioners from the Michigan Public Service Commission. And we provided input to the council, which incorporated that into the plan. At the end, the governor adopted that plan. And the next step was legislative implementation. And there was a bill package introduced in both the Senate and the House early last year that took on a number of the major planks of the My Healthy Climate Plan. Some of those are still sitting in the legislature, but major pieces were adopted in November and signed by the governor right at the end of November of 2023. So I'm going to talk a little more about those provisions, but first I want to share a graph from the My Healthy Climate Plan as context for this. So let me verify that you can now see a window that I'm sharing.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. So this gives you an idea of the sources of greenhouse gas emissions and the dynamics of that. So the blue bars are 2005 levels. The orange brown ones are 2019 levels. Where we are today is not very much different than 2019. Principally, there's been further reduction in the energy production area. That energy production is predominantly electricity generation. Transportation is all forms, but dominated by on-road vehicles. The built environment is both residential and commercial buildings. Energy intensive industry is basically all of those industries that both either use a whole lot of energy, hence the name, but also significantly often have processes that release greenhouse gases in addition to their energy use. So things like steel, where reduction of iron is done with carbon, and that produces carbon emissions. Cement manufacturing releases carbon dioxide from the limestone that's used, to produce the cement, and so on. And then natural lands is in Michigan predominantly about forests and wetlands, both of which are carbon sinks. They take in more carbon from the atmosphere than they release, and so that counterbalances some of the emissions. And agriculture and waste, a lot of those emissions are methane from manures and that sort of thing. And the waste part, methane from landfill decay of organic materials. So that's kind of the picture we're all looking at of what we need to address. And, as you can see, it's a major change in many sectors of our economy. The My Healthy Climate Plan was focused on particularly those things that needed to be done to reach the 52% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And as you can see, that we have had a history of decline in the greenhouse gas emissions from power generation, a little bit from transportation, mostly due to the national CAFE standards, reducing the fuel consumption of the vehicles that are on the road, and then energy intensive industry, and that is largely from them converting from coal and oil, which had become more expensive, to natural gas, which had become cheaper, during this period. Not much change in the built environment in agriculture or in natural lands over this period. So the legislative package was framed as being about climate, which automatically meant that it was partisan. Some of the component policies, like energy efficiency, we have traditionally had bipartisan support. In fact, we had Republican control of the legislature for both the 2008 and 2016 packages. But this bill package wound up being adopted on party lines. The Democratic majority was essentially one person, two votes in each house. So that meant literally every Democrat had to support the package, and that dictated the nature of the legislative bargain that happened. The bill package that emerged is primarily about electricity, utility regulation. It does continue the sorts of energy efficiency programs that Stacy talked about and enhance them, increasing the minimum standards for every utility and also the shareholder incentives for higher levels of performance, increasing the obligations for programs for low-income households, building in workforce development targeted to those communities where employment is, particularly well-paid employment, is harder to come by, and then added electrification. So a lot of what Stacy described applies to Michigan as well. On the power production side, two major pieces. One is we require regulated electric utilities to periodically submit to the Public Service Commission and gain, or they have the opportunity to get financial benefits and risk reduction by gaining commission approval of what's called an integrated resource plan, which lays out how the utility is going to meet its obligations to supply power to its customers for a 15 to 20 year time frame, and comply with applicable laws and other policy considerations. The integrated resource planning language was changed to give greater emphasis to greenhouse gas reduction, and to environmental justice. And then changes were made to incorporate the clean energy standards and renewable energy standards that I'm about to speak to. One of the bills increased that renewable energy standard of 15% by 2021 to 50% by 2030 and 60% by 2035, and then establishes a clean energy standard of 80% by 2035 and 100% by 2040. A clean energy standard says that the utility has to source the power it sells to its customers from renewables or nuclear or natural gas with carbon capture and storage. So it doesn't prohibit fossil generation in Michigan. It's just that they have to source enough from either within or outside of Michigan of these clean energy sources to meet their sales. So you should expect that there'll be a mixture of some imports of clean energy offset by exports of fossil generation rather than a complete shutdown of fossil generation in Michigan in order to comply. That's the set of standards that will drive further reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the electric sector in Michigan. And then with the cleaning up of the grid, we are now at the point where electrification of both the built environment and transportation results in an expected reduction in total greenhouse gas emissions. And so the change in energy efficiency and electrification programs for the built environment will contribute to that greenhouse gas reduction. There is the opportunity to focus some of those utility programs on energy intensive industry and gain some ground there. But there's a lot of policy missing if we're actually going to decarbonize energy intensive industry. And then transportation, utilities can contribute by helping with charging infrastructure, but that policy field remains open as to how we're going to achieve the level of electrification that's necessary to meet the ambitions of the My Healthy Climate Plan. So that's kind of where we are in Michigan and the kinds of legislation recently adopted. And with that, I think I'll stop and we'll hear about Minnesota and then happy to answer your questions.
All right. Thanks, Douglas. Justin, that's your cue. And then, as Douglas said, after Justin has gone, we will do the whole thing where you let me know if you have a question and we'll do some Q&A.
Awesome. 1 second here.
We see something.
That's not,
Yeah, it's gonna, that one wanted to do your notes.
yeah. Bear with me for a second. We're running up against my IT limitations.
Do you have more than one screen?
Okay.
All right,
Okay.
that looks more like a slideshow. Yep,
Okay.
cool.
All right. Well, thanks for bearing with me there. Hello, everyone. I really appreciate the invitation to chat with you all today. Again, my name is Justin Fay. I'm the Public Affairs Director for Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization headquartered in St. Paul, Minnesota. We work to shape and drive bold policy solutions to achieve carbon neutral economies. Our programmatic work is primarily based in Minnesota, but we do venture outside of our state borders on occasion. And a few projects of ours that folks on the call might be familiar with. If any of you have ever read Midwest Energy News or the Energy News Network, we're the fiscal sponsor or host for that operation. And then we've also, up until about a week ago, we're the fiscal sponsor of an organization called the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition that is working in all of the states that are, I believe, represented on the call on energy efficiency and building electrification work in an equitable manner. But our organization is, we have about 30, I think we're at 34 staff currently. Our mission is economy-wide, and so our kind of bread and butter, our history as an organization is electricity focused, but the work we're doing today in 2024 is much broader than that, and moving forward, I think this will be a pattern that's true across all of the states you're hearing from. We're really thinking about economy-wide decarbonization. I always like to start with just a little bit of, before we jump into policy and politics, just like what's happening with emissions in Minnesota. And so this is very similar to, this is the Minnesota version of what Doug shared in his presentation, sector by sector analysis that is updated on a biannual basis by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, which is our state environmental agency. You can see we're making some okay progress with electricity generation, and I think given the dates of the data we're looking at, thanks to a global pandemic, some temporary reductions that are pretty significant in transportation and commercial buildings. But we've got a lot of work to do elsewhere. Emissions from industry and from residential buildings are actually climbing. As much work as and progress as we made in some of those other sectors, some of those emissions reductions are being offset by the fact that we're still actually increasing emissions from significant parts of the economy. Statewide, our goal, which was updated in law in 2020 during the 23 legislative session, is to be net zero economy-wide by 2050. We have interim benchmarks along the way, benchmark to a 2005 baseline. The 30% by 2025, as of the data I just showed you, we are barely on track to meet that. And we're likely not on track to meet any of the benchmarks beyond 2025. A little bit about the political landscape in Minnesota. So we, in the 2022 statewide election, we had single party control of state government for the first time in a decade, and the second time in I think the last 35 years, give or take. So we have a Democrat as governor. Democrats have very narrow margins, very narrow margin majorities in the state House and the state Senate. The Senate in particular is 34 Democrats, 33 Republicans. And there's a very, very slightly larger buffer in the House. That follows 4 years of a split legislature, and for almost the entirety of the last 40 years in Minnesota, there's been some version of split government. Although Minnesota has a kind of progressive reputation in statewide elections, and what we do when presidential elections come around. In our state politics, it really is, we really are a very purple state, and that continues to be true today. The other thing I would just note that perhaps is a little bit different than some other states in the region, that was a really big deal for us and what we're able to accomplish at the state level in 2023, is we had a historic for Minnesota budget surplus. The state came into the current 2-year biennium with a $17 billion with a B dollar surplus, which is massive for a state the size of Minnesota in particular. So that put our state lawmakers and advocates and other stakeholders in a really different, advantaged position in terms of being able to put resources behind policy initiatives that we were asking for. A few of the highlights from 2023, it's been referenced a couple of times, but the investment coming from the federal government through the bipartisan infrastructure law, through the Inflation Reduction Act, and other Biden administration and congressional initiatives is massive, and the scale and scope of that can't really be overstated. A lot of those funds require either matching funds, either to be unlocked or benefit from the existence of matching funds in the case of programs that fund competitive grants. So a major priority for the state of Minnesota was to make sure that the resources were being provided at the state level in order to maximize both what Minnesota's allocation should be, and ideally overperform by putting resources on the table that could leverage additional outside funding. And that was largely very successful. We're able to pass $200 million in funding for a program called our State Competitiveness Fund, which is basically a pot of resources that our state commerce department, which has energy oversight responsibility in Minnesota, has at its discretion to support applications for various federal grant funding opportunities that might emerge from either state agencies or from local units of government. Building codes has been a particular niche area of interest for our organization for a long time. I know Stacy mentioned there was some work in Illinois around building codes, around a stretch code. We have a little bit of a different landscape for building codes in Minnesota. We have a uniform statewide building code, and a lot of built-in institutional inertia around protecting that. So municipal stretch codes is not really a politically or practically viable option for us. So the work we've been doing at the state level has been really about trying to accelerate code adoption statewide. And we now have in law in Minnesota that the commercial building code will need to achieve 80% savings relative to 2021 baseline by 2036. So that's been a very difficult and is a kind of politically complex set of issues for us locally, but one that we're really proud of having made some progress. Minnesota Innovation Finance Authority is Minnesota's version of a green bank. The purpose of it or intention behind it is to really try to leverage both public money from other sources, including and especially the federal government, as well as private capital to create financing pathways for projects that otherwise would have difficulty accessing capital. So in particular, projects serving under-resourced communities, projects that have either on the business side or on the service recipient side, significant BIPOC or under-resourced community participation. And then I couldn't possibly list them all, but there is just a whole laundry list of public rebate and grant programs that were adopted and funded during the 2023 legislative session. Couple that we worked on at Fresh Energy was a program to support homeowners upgrading electric panels in their homes. There's a similar program that was passed as part of the Inflation Reduction Act at the federal level. We were working on it first, though. And then a similar program for heat pumps. Couple kind of beyond energy, a couple other policies that we worked on that I thought were worth lifting up. The Frontline Communities Protection Act is a policy that requires the state of Minnesota to consider the cumulative impacts of pollution when making regulatory and permitting decisions. We worked on that alongside a pretty broad-based coalition of environmental justice advocates, frontline community organizations, and that is in the process of being implemented through a state rulemaking process currently. And then transportation, often when we think about transportation and climate, the conversation is about electrification and electric vehicles. And we definitely took some steps forward in 2023. For the first time, Minnesota just within the last, I think, week, rolled out statewide consumer rebates for electric vehicle sales for the first time. It's the first time we've had that at the state level in Minnesota. But we also invested or approved new metropolitan regional sales tax in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region to support transit funding and transportation infrastructure. That's been an ongoing need for our Metropolitan Transit Agency. So that's going to provide a lot of regional benefits, we hope. Looking forward, thinking about not just the legislative session, but kind of work generally, the kind of flagship achievement from the 2023 session for Minnesota was our 100% clean electricity policy. It requires 100% of Minnesota's electricity to be sourced from carbon-free energy generation by 2040, which is among the most ambitious policies of its kind nationally. And as a kind of follow-up to that, we're thinking very intentionally about what are the barriers to actually achieving that policy. It's one thing to adopt as a state policy framework and market and regulatory signal that we're going to achieve this goal. Actually, breaking ground and getting projects built and connected is a different thing and requires different kinds of policy interventions. And so that's everything from transmission to community organizing to some things that maybe candidly are a little less in our control and a little less in the state's ability to influence around kind of global economics, supply chain issues, and politics. Our legislative session actually starts for the new year on Monday. We have a seasonal legislature. I think Michigan is year-round, and I'm guessing maybe Illinois is also. So we only have to deal with our legislature for 4 to 5 months of the year. Some of the things that we're expecting to be spending a lot of time on, we're seeing debated at the legislature this year, include what we call a bonding bill, which is really just a large public works package. There's a lot of climate potential when we're talking about infrastructure investments. Major public building retrofits is a low-key, not super exciting, but ultimately very impactful way to unlock a lot of energy savings, and also integrate on-site renewables if the project's being designed that way. Transmission and permitting, I think, is going to be a very high, kind of major policy focus. Minnesota does a lot of things really well. Fast and efficient regulation that facilitates projects being deployed efficiently is maybe not at the top of the list of things that we are known to be successful at. So we're going to be taking a look at kind of the full suite of environmental project permitting, renewable energy siting, transmission siting and permitting. And there's a pretty broad-based stakeholder report that was just produced by our Public Utilities Commission that will be the basis for starting that legislative conversation. Clean Transportation Standard is our local branding for what most states would refer to as a low carbon fuel standard or low carbon fuels policy, LCFS. It requires, provides basically a credit system for incentivizing lower carbon intensity fuels. The lowest carbon intensity fuel of all is electricity. So over the long run, we see this as a market-based mechanism to drive electrification at the state level. And the last two.
Oh,
Sorry, go ahead.
Jay, just to make sure we're almost wrapped up here, I want to make sure there's room for Q&A.
I've got one more slide and then we're done.
Okay, great.
The last two bullets are really emerging sectors. So the building sector, and when I say the building sector, what I really mean is the gas distribution system. Starting to have we're going to be harder conversations about what does it look like to decarbonize that system? What do you do with the infrastructure that's already in the ground? How in a cold weather state like Minnesota, do you heat homes and buildings in winter? There are answers to all of those questions, but it's complicated both technically and politically, and we're very much in the early stages of that. And of course, the legislature is not the only venue that we're doing this work in. Our State Public Utilities Commission is just within the last week received Xcel Energy's Integrated Resource Plan. That's the every 2-year filing that investor-owned utilities have to make in Minnesota, and Xcel's our kind of flagship by a wide margin, largest utility that we have. Clean Heat Minnesota is a coalition that Fresh Energy is helping to co-lead to really start to do public education around alternatives to gas from a home user perspective, as well as helping to seed the regulatory conversation. And then we're continuing to work really hard on implementation of various federal policy, federal investments, and that full suite of state policy and investment changes that were made in 2023. So I will pause. I will stop there. Happy to do questions.
All right. Thanks, Justin and Douglas and Stacy. So folks, you're from a lot of these states, or you might have questions at the wider level of these. I'm sure they can at least point you in the right direction to what other Great Lakes states are doing. But let me know if you have a question and we will go from there. So who wants to lead us off? Izzy?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this. curious to hear about Michigan, but also other states as well, depending on what the situation is. In the legislation from this fall, a lot of focus was on the Public Service Commission in Michigan taking over siting authority of larger renewable projects. And I'm curious to hear, I guess, how you think that will affect implementation of those projects, either in Michigan or Minnesota or Illinois has dealt with that as well.
It's a very good question. So I didn't detail about one. There were 3 bills related to siting. A couple of them were technical. One of them did, as you described, provide for commission authority to approve siting. So for clarity for everyone, first of all, this law only affects what were identified as large projects, meaning wind projects over 100 megawatts and solar and storage projects over 50 megawatts. And the law allows a developer to go to the commission instead of the local zoning authority, but does not require that. And further set up some criteria where a local government could adopt what is labeled as a comparable renewable energy ordinance. And if they do so, then the developer must first go to the local government. And then if they get turned down there or don't get prompt consideration, they can appeal to the commission. The standards that were included are a little bit looser than strictly necessary for commercial feasibility, but not a lot. So you can think of them as essentially allowing renewable siting as long as the standards are commercially feasible. This was very much contested. There were a lot of amendments in the middle of the night in the last stages of adopting the bill. And as happens with those kinds of amendments, there's some ambiguities in the law. So that'll have to be worked out. That window at the commission opens essentially a year from now. And the commission will have to get ready. It's something they've not done before. So there's a lot of capacity development and process development and so on will be necessary. Meanwhile, there is opposition, unsurprisingly. And there is currently a ballot initiative beginning to be circulated that would repeal that siting law. Should they be successful in collecting enough signatures by, they have to submit them by May 29th, which effectively means have to have them collected by May 27th, they could get on the November ballot in Michigan. For completeness, there is an intermediate stage where the legislature could adopt the ballot proposal and then it not go on the ballot. But anyway, that getting all those signatures is a steep hill in a finite amount of time. So it may or may not happen, but it does reflect that there's significant opposition, particularly in rural areas, to the siting of large renewables projects. Prognosticating on the effects, there are a number of requirements imposed on a developer who goes to the commission. And I think that developers will tend to still go to local governments as long as there's a commercially viable path, because they will avoid obligations for funding intervention by parties who disagree with them, for community benefits, contributions that are fairly substantial, and for an extended decision timeline if you go to the commission. There will be some local governments that'll just continue to oppose and say, we don't want to be in the position of approving these projects. You're going to have to go to the commission. There will also, I think, be a number that will try to find either legally comparable renewable energy ordinances or ordinances close enough to it that it's still attractive to developers to come to the local government and have more local control. That path for large projects will not be sufficient to meet all of our siting requirements. There's need for better accommodation of small projects, both behind the meter and in front of the meter for solar, that we'll have to struggle our way through. We have an incomplete policy menu there. Hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Douglas. Michael had a question.
Yeah, I guess all of you could answer this, but given my parochial interest, question's mostly for Stacy. I keep hearing that one of the big problems in facilitating this transition is the inability to essentially move the energy. So whether the power lines are there to transmit the energy, or if they're, there you hear this talk about congestion that prevents renewable projects from going online. I know there's been the couple that I can think of offhand. There's the Grain Belt Express that would go into Illinois. There's the Sioux Green Line, if I remember right, from Iowa to suburban Chicago, that is, I guess, intended to bring wind to where people live. And I know a lot of this, I guess I'll also say, I know a lot of this depends on FERC or the federal government, but what are states trying to do, like the ICC trying to do, to speed up this work? Because if I remember right, the Sioux Green Line got FERC approval in like 2010 or something like that, and it still hasn't been built.
Yeah, so let me talk generally, and then this is a pretty detailed question, so we could probably follow up on this a little bit later, and Kaylee's on as well. But this is true for all the states. So when you talk about, but Illinois in particular, because we're a deregulated state, it is a little bit different based on generation and distribution. We're also a little bit of a different little animal because we're in two different regional transmission organizations, right? So ComEd is in PJM, Ameren is in MISO. I think Michigan has a little bit of that too, where they have one, like there's a difference between the two RTOs. So the RTOs have a whole different other structure. Now, I will say in Illinois, we have one commissioner that sits on OPSI, which is the organization of PJM states, and one that sits on OMS, which is the organization of MISO states. And they are really trying to, they don't have authority necessarily over those RTOs, but they are in an advisory capacity. We do file comments with FERC on all of these issues that come up. So some of that stuff we can put together for you on a secondary phone call. I will say this stuff is really sticky and challenging and nuanced and hard to understand, but this is a great time where we would love to set up calls to really explain to you kind of what the situation is and what the challenges are. On this issue in particular, Illinois at Northwestern, they actually do a session with regulators from across the country. They do it multiple times a year. I'm looking at the name of it. It's part of the Northwestern Center for Law and Business and Economics, but they call it the Northwestern University Electricity Dialogue, and we actually spend a lot of time talking through distribution and some of the challenges, not just electricity, we also hit on natural gas. So if we could take some of this offline, I think it's going to be too hard to get into all the details here, but the commissions are involved. We are communicating to FERC. Like I said, we are on all these advisory capacities. We are tracking all of that stuff. In Illinois, the one thing I can't talk about is obviously under CEJA, there was a utility, the electric utilities had to put together a multi-year grid plan. That was before us. We rejected it. So now that's getting refiled. So we can't really speak to anything more than that. But that is something that's going to come up in that as well.
Okay, thanks.
So sorry,
This is
that was a
Douglas.
lot of
No, no, no.
words,
Yeah,
but
that's. I
really
mean, yeah,
answer
I
your
know.
question.
Maybe I'm getting too technical there, but it does seem like the there's all the talk about the big fancy projects or that's what gets a lot of the headlines, and then the nitty gritty is like, can they actually provide electricity, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like I said, I think we could definitely set up an off the record conversation to kind of talk through all of that, and happy to do it.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah. This is Douglas. I'd just like to inject a couple of small supplements. First of all, my now retired partner, Skip Pruss, and I authored a paper for the Council on the Great Lakes region a couple of years ago, looking at sort of cross-border issues on energy. And one point is that there really is need for, as well as opportunity for, additional transmission between Canada and the United States. It would be beneficial for both sides. And the second and related is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provided a lot of funding to the U.S. Department of Energy to try to advance the development of transmission. One of the things under consideration is kind of an overlay transmission system. So just avoiding being too technical, current transmission is alternating current. There's a technology of direct current that can go greater distances and sort of skip over some of those congestion problems. And there's a notion called the macro grid, which would essentially be another even higher layer transmission system that would span the continent. And there's some really quite astoundingly large numbers for the benefits of doing that. And that's something that DOE is investing in planning and may emerge in the relatively near future as a way that transmission will be done differently.
Thanks, Douglas. All right, we had a question from Luann.
Yeah, I was curious about how these state targets are defining clean and renewable energy. I know in the Michigan example that you mentioned natural gas is included in that definition. If there's carbon capture, I know that some waste to energy projects were also defined under renewable energy. So I was just curious from any of the states, what are the conversations or kind of the factors that are happening that are leading to these definitions? Or what gets included as renewable?
We'll probably all have different answers, so I'll just be very quick. Wind and solar for sure count sort of everywhere. In Michigan, we restrict hydropower to dams that already exist, not wanting to encourage additional dams. But frankly, most of the opportunities are already dammed up. And then the disputes are all around biomass. Burning wood, mixing it with tires, getting waste, manure, food waste through anaerobic digesters, landfill gas, those kinds of things. And those are all hedged in various ways, but still allowed in Michigan. For clean, we defined it as anything that counts as renewable, plus nuclear, plus gas with carbon capture and storage that is at least 90% effective.
I could jump in from Minnesota. So we actually have two different frameworks on the books in Minnesota. We have a carbon-free standard and we have a renewable energy standard. The renewable energy standard dates to 2007. And as part of the larger bill that included the carbon-free standard. The renewable energy standard was also sort of extended and given some new numbers. So there's a what we think is a very modest target of 55% renewable electricity for Minnesota in 2035. But for us, the bigger deal is, and that the renewable energy standard has a list of technologies that are specifically defined as eligible in law. And then the carbon-free standard says the 100% carbon-free law that passed this past spring simply says that in order to qualify, you can't emit carbon as a function of operating the electricity source. So it would not allow any form of natural gas to comply, but does allow utilities the option to buy credits. So if you say had a natural gas plant and you're capturing carbon, and so your actual emissions are relatively low, a utility might choose to do that and then offset the emissions through credits. But the actual compliance is, or the actual definition is no carbon emitted.
Stacy, did you have anything to add, or should I move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think ours matches up to Doug's in Michigan. Obviously, you're going to have to dig into the statute and what gets negotiated by the legislature. That's how all these things work out. Illinois just added some things about hydro, actually, that we were just talking about this morning. But similarly, yes, you're talking about, and ours is very focused on carbon free. So everything's really tied to our nuclear fleet and where that is and how that's transitioning out. But you do have the traditional renewables based on wind, solar, things like that. And like I said, we've added hydro, carbon capture and storage. And then we have some definitions on waste heat to power, CHP, which is combined heat and power.
All right, thanks. Carol, you had a question.
I do, thank you. This is fairly open-ended. I would like to hear more about the challenge of decarbonizing heavy industry. What makes that so hard? And are there any like clear or potential first steps or next steps to actually accomplishing that? And what would those be?
I can go first, and I will talk generally on this one. So one of the issues that comes up with industrial is the intensity of the energy source that's coming in. So the challenge right now, as I understand it, related to renewable energy, is it has the potential to be intermittent, and then that can ruin a process in the middle of it, which is why they need a consistent intensity of energy at the same time. That's not true for all industry, but for certain industry, that would be the case for steel manufacturing. That would be the case for concrete, things like that. And I will say that is one thing we announced in our natural gas rate cases in the fall that we were initiating a future of gas proceeding in Illinois. We're in the process of designing what that will be, but you'll see in there as we broke that out, one of the things that we talked about is a very detailed discussion on the industrial sector and understanding what those energy needs are. But that is a big issue that you see, especially throughout the Midwest, where we have a lot of heavy industry that's really been supported by the coal fleets that have been here or the nuclear fleets that have just guaranteed that kind of direct power the whole time through. So that's what I'll just say generally from my experience.
Following up, the direct emissions from industry are mostly from heating fuels, where they're providing heat to some industrial process. And it's useful to think about those in temperature ranges. So a lot of industries, especially things like food processing, have heat needs that are around or below boiling, and those actually technologically can be addressed with heat pumps, but there's still a cost differential for industrial heat pump with electricity versus natural gas. Then there's a range that's more typical of, say, the chemical industry, where it's temperatures that are well above boiling but are delivered by steam under pressure. And there you get to the sort of energy intensity problems, but it's still doable with electricity. And then finally, there are a few industries, and steel is a good example, where with current production processes, the temperatures that are required are very high. And there's something called an electric arc furnace. You can get pretty high temperatures with that, and a lot of steel mills are done that way, especially those that use recycled steel. But blast furnaces that convert iron want to be even higher. And what many people are looking at there is hydrogen. In addition, I mentioned that there are these process emissions. So right now you convert iron ore to steel by mixing it with carbon and heating it. So there's a chemical reaction and carbon comes off of that. So right now the leading alternative is hydrogen as the reducing agent, not as a fuel, but as the thing that gets injected with the iron into the furnace in order to turn iron into steel. And there are a series of industries where that's the nature of the problem. So a lot of the excitement and interest in hydrogen is about these process industries that release carbon dioxide in their chemical processes. So that's kind of the technological landscape. And then the other aspect of it is these are all facilities that have very large investments. They've been tuned over many years to be very efficient with the kind of process that they use, and they're in international price competition. So they're very sensitive to anything that would increase their costs, even temporarily reduce their productivity, or cut into their market share. So, I'm not saying it's not possible to make progress. We believe there are opportunities for real progress, but it's something that those industries will have to work at in order to make a successful transition, and we need policy support for them to do so.
Thanks, Douglas. All right, I think we have time for our last two questions here from Sherry and Fatima. So Sherry, you're up first.
Hi, Doug, this question is for you. I'm here in Michigan. As you mentioned in one of your previous responses, we have until 2040 here in Michigan to get 100% of our electricity from renewable or clean sources, according to those legislated definitions. So to that 40%, between the 60% renewable and then to the 100 clean, that 40% that you mentioned, the nuclear or natural gas with carbon capture. Given the greenhouse gas emissions and the environmental justice concerns connected to uranium mining and the technological struggles with effective open air carbon capture, how do you envision how Michigan is going to make that 40%? Do you think those are really going to be our only options? Or do you think that the MISO planned long-range transmission line from Wisconsin to Ludington may be a relevant factor?
Yeah. All good questions. So just very quickly, nuclear is today 20% of Michigan's power generation. It was about 23% before Palisades closed. And for those not in Michigan, you may not be aware, but there is an effort to restart the Palisades plant. We'll have to see if that's successful. But whether or not that happens, there's a gap. And nuclear plants don't last forever. So at some point, the ones that we have will have to be replaced, either with nuclear or something else. And new nuclear has difficulty competing on price with renewables. So, my bet is that we will see, rather than a lot of new nuclear, we'll see some of that gap with renewables beyond the minimum requirement. And then open air carbon capture, I think, is unlikely. It is energy inefficient and economically difficult. I think there's a possibility of carbon capture at the stack, if you will, from gas plants. That definitely is what I think we'll see as a proposal from DTE. Jerry Norcia, the CEO, made comments to that effect to the Monroe County Chamber a couple days ago. But we'll have to see if that can compete with renewables. The big question really is storage. If storage of the right kinds becomes cheap enough, then renewables probably sweep the field, on this gradually. To your question about transmission, absolutely. This old thing that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, that is certainly true in any given place. And to some extent, you address that with storage or flexible demand. But usually the wind's blowing somewhere and the sun shines more hours of the day across the country than it does in any one place. So this large-scale transmission network I referenced earlier is probably going to come into play for that. And a linkage between the Northern Plains and Michigan by way of something crossing Lake Michigan, Manitowoc to Ludington or something like that would be a likely piece of that, as well as links to the hydropower available from Quebec across Ontario.
All right. And Fatima, you can take us home with the final question of the session.
Hi, this has been really helpful. So I'm in Ontario, in Canada, and some of the examples that you all brought were very interesting, but very specific to what's happening in America. And I was wondering how much of, what is being considered in your states has cross-border implications, and whether you have any advice for a reporter like me in terms of what I should be focusing on when looking at what's happening in your states.
I will speak just very generally, but I would say Doug brought this up before too. The interconnection that's going to happen between the RTOs is definitely going to have an absolute influence on what's happening in Canada. As we figure out how to connect, in particular in the Midwest, it's SPP, PJM, and MISO. All of that's going to pick up the central provinces of Canada. So that would be the biggest thing that I would say to you. And then the question for that is, yes, how are things coming online? What is happening with the queue? All of those kind of things are the two big issues.
And I would add, Doug made a reference to hydropower contracts from Quebec. We have something similar with hydropower contracts in Manitoba here. So how those contracts and that kind of transnational generation is treated in some of these state-based policies is a relevant question, and the answer might vary from state to state.
And just to close it out, people thinking about how we have a reliable electricity supply with a high renewable share of the generation portfolio generally recognize that principal problem is weather systems that can temporarily, or maybe for a few days, reduce the supply of power in a given region. And the thumbnail version of the solution is that the transmission system needs to have market areas that are bigger than weather systems. And that really means at a continental scale. So I don't think the US and Canadian governments are engaged with each other to the degree that is necessary. There is a lot of power exchange already across the border, but I think both transmission planning and market-to-market transactions need to be better enabled. And that'd be good for both countries in terms of achieving greenhouse gas reductions and a reliable grid at the same time.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for spending an hour and a half with us and answering our questions. I know that was a whole lot of information, but like I warned everyone, this is just getting stuff on your radar and introducing you to speakers like these and other sources of information. So that really helped us kind of set the stage for policy and legislation, and we appreciate your time. So here's your IJNR round of applause. Thank you so much
Stacey,
for,
Justin, and Douglas.
yeah,
Thank you.
we really appreciate this. And you haven't heard the last of everyone that you just talked to. They will get your contact information, and I'm sure they'll be following up.
Mhm.
And for our reporters, we have an hour now before the final session of the day. So go do something that isn't staring at a screen. And Stacey, Douglas, and Justin, thanks again. It's very much appreciated. And we'll see everybody back here in an hour.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Francisco, I think we're pretty set. And we might need to just whip up bios it's just going to be Jesse and Beth for the final session. You're muted.
Sorry, audio. Yeah, I have the bios for both of them.
Okay, cool.
Are we gonna do what we did last time, or are we just gonna keep this open and let them?
I think I'll keep it open. I'll stop recording.
Okay.